What if you could have a career where the opportunities are as vast as our nation, where it's not about mission statements, but a shared mission? At U.S. Customs and Border Protection, we go beyond to protect more than borders. From ship to shore, air to ground, cities to local communities, CBP agents and officers are keeping people safe. Join U.S. Customs and Border Protection and go beyond for something far greater than yourself. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers. What if you could have a career where the opportunities are as vast as our nation, where it's not about mission statements, but a shared mission? At U.S. Customs and Border Protection, we go beyond to protect more than borders. From ship to shore, air to ground, cities to local communities, CBP agents and officers are keeping people safe. Join U.S. Customs and Border Protection and go beyond for something far greater than yourself. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.
With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Yeah, welcome back to Heard Tell. She's one of our favorites, but she's been busy and we haven't had her on. That's my fault. Now she's back. Brooke Medina, she's the VP of Comms for John Locke in North Carolina. Real good friend. We go way back to when I first started doing this stuff. She was crazy enough to put me on one of their podcasts, and look where that went. So those of you in my comments who always want to know who to blame, here they be. Brooke Medina, thanks for being back. How are you?
I'm great. And I feel like with that sort of intro and setup, this actually means you owe me some royalties for being on Heard Tell now and having this podcast launch, and far exceeding anything we ever talked about or did on Civitalk, my old podcast with Ray.
Yeah, I need to. I hadn't talked to Ray in a while. I need to reach out to him. Yeah, I'll give you 20% of my $1.45 from Medium this month. We'll hook that up. You mentioned Civitas. They still call it the Civitas poll. Let's talk about that. We're getting into an area here now where the Democrats have even come up with a motto for it. It's actually pretty good branding. They're talking about 5 to flip, 5 Senate races they think they've got a good look at. Polling looks like they got a good look at it. And to a lot of folks' surprise, North Carolina's one of them. Y'all did the polling. They're onto something here. What did your polling show in the North Carolina Senate race?
Yeah, I mean, this is either Ted Budd or Cheri Beasley's race to lose at this juncture. Our polling found that they are in a dead heat. It's 42.3% on both sides. And so this is something that is, the gap is closing. So if you're on the Budd campaign or if you're Ted Budd himself, you're feeling a little bit more nervous about this. So we pulled this back in June as well. And in June, there was certainly a sizable gap. I believe Budd was about 5% ahead of Beasley on that front. But that gap has certainly closed since June. Of course, nothing has happened in the news since June, right? Senate is completely inconsequential. I say that in tongue in cheek. This is really, this is going to be a very, very tight race. And this is going to be a intense battle going into the election season.
Now, the interesting number that actually popped off to me here, besides that virtual tie and in the margin of error, of course, these are two people who have good name recognition inside the state of North Carolina. Cheri Beasley, of course, was a Supreme Court justice. For folks outside of North Carolina, her leaving the Supreme Court, that was a messy, big news story. The Supreme Court flipped. So most people know who she is. Of course, Ted Budd was a sitting representative, and he won his primary. We'll get to that in just a minute. But even with all that name recognition, even with this being a very hotly contested race, your polling shows there's still 12% undecided. That's a high number for getting into the end of August here.
It is, but I think that it really speaks to the political disenchantment of many North Carolina voters. We have, as our largest voting bloc, unaffiliated voters. So these are voters like myself who oftentimes we don't want to affiliate so directly with a political party, despite the fact of holding very, very clear and very principled views oftentimes on politics and policy. But these are voters who are just like, you know what, I'm not super excited about either candidate right now, or there's just a big question mark and I'm waiting to see how the economy pans out, to see what else is going to unveil itself between now and November. And so I agree, though, this is a really high number of undecideds. So it'll be interesting as we poll this again next month as well as October and see how things shape out. But this is going to be a very, very expensive race. The Bud team, I would say, has definitely dragged their feet when it comes to advertising, especially on cable news. We see Cheri Beasley ads all the time. She seems very competent, very centrist is how she's presenting herself, despite the fact that she has a history and record on the Supreme Court as well as other courts that I would say North Carolinians are wise to look into and examine and decide for themselves whether or not she's as centrist as she posits herself.
Chad Adams, who's a longtime radio host, he partners with us on Big Talker. I thought he had one of the most prescient things on this race, and this was a couple of weeks ago before this started moving, even when the Ted Budd first won his primary. He said, and you can break this down for folks who don't understand this reference, he said, watch out for Beasley because she's going to run the Kay Hagan playbook. And that's pretty much what it looks like it's happened. For folks that don't understand that reference, of course, the late Kay Hagan, unfortunately, she caught encephalitis of all things and passed away a few years ago. She was the senator in North Carolina. She took out Elizabeth Dole, surprising a lot of people, part of the Obama wave in 2008. And she ran as a centrist, but then she voted pretty along the lines, Democrat, rather liberal, but she was able to maintain her seat by running as a moderate. Cheri Beasley, of course, is a Democrat. She's mainline towards liberal Democrat on most of her policies, but that's what she's running ads on being a centrist. She's running ads on bipartisanship. She's running ads. She's eschewing the cultural issues, going to kind of meat and potatoes, jobs, stuff you would expect from a Democratic candidate. Looks like it's working.
Yeah. Oh, it certainly is. And this is something that when Hagan and Tillis, I believe, ran against each other, she wasn't showing up to debates. Tillis was, and this is almost like the inverse. Cheri Beasley just agreed to do a debate with the National Broadcasters Association, and Bud is silent. The John Locke Foundation hosted its own debate with Carolina Journal during the GOP primary, and Bud didn't show up. He has refused to show up at many of these, so it's almost like the flip. But Cheri Beasley is getting the opportunity to continue to throw herself out there as someone who is very reasonable, not someone who is like the typical DC politician that we're disenchanted with right now. So it'll be interesting to see if voters buy into that, or if the Bud team ramps up their opposition, starts digging up some dirt, becomes a little bit more aggressive. But for right now, the only campaign ad that I've seen on the Bud side, despite a lot of Club for Growth PAC money, is one of a grocery store and a little girl in a grocery store. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, let's talk about Bud for a second because you mentioned it. Brooke Medina joining us from John Locke. During the primary, that was the knock. He didn't show up for the debates. He didn't do anything. I interviewed him for radio. I asked him directly. I was like, what are you making of this? He goes, we've got our data. We know our numbers. We're going to all 55 counties. We're going to talk to everybody. We know what we're doing. We're going to win this thing. He was right. I was wrong. He won his primary very handily, quite frankly. And it worked for him. He rode the Trump endorsement. The Club for Growth ads were absolutely everywhere. And he won. So I was wrong. He was right. However, maybe I was just a little too quick for it because he's doing the same thing, it seems like, in the general election. And the general election is not the same beast. He has the Donald Trump endorsement, but Donald Trump is not on this ticket. He's not going to be on the ballot to help buoy him, even though it was a Democratic or a Trump state in 2020. I think he's making a mistake here. He's not engaging. He's laying low. I know the learned behavior as it worked for him in the primaries. I think he's making a mistake here. I think you're absolutely right, because even the Club for Growth ads, I haven't been seeing the ads like I did in the primaries all of a sudden lately. Maybe they're holding it, but I'm watching these poll numbers move around. You can only lose so much ground. You need to do something proactive. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the thing. It's like, it did pan out for him, despite the fact that many of us were skeptical during the primaries that would be a good strategy for him. Yep, and we were wrong. It clearly, it ended up being the strategy that he needed for a Republican primary. It is interesting that Club for Growth was so aggressive and spent so much during the primary. But yep, it seems like more crickets at this juncture. But again, this is the end of August. It's not September or October yet, so maybe they're saving their war chest for later. We'll see what happens. But right now, if I was an advisor on that campaign, I'm certainly wondering, okay, let's actually get you out in front. Let's get you ahead of these issues. This is, for many analysts, a lot of people believe this is the Republicans' midterm to lose. But I think too many people sometimes take things for granted on the political front, when nothing should ever be taken for granted when it comes to the electorate.
Yeah, and Senate races are very different cyclically than the House races, which we know the cycle for those. This is not unusual if you go through American history that the Senate and the House split off a little bit on the political cycles. There was other stuff in the Civitas poll I wanted to ask you about real quick, though. Obviously, the number one issue on everybody's mind is the economy. There's some interesting nuggets in here about the economy, wasn't there? Especially when it comes, now we know oil and gas prices, almost 87%. Trying to get 90% of anybody on any polling ever is really hard to do. You managed to do it here. That's pretty remarkable. But some of the other stuff on here was very interesting. Talk about some of the other issues polled here, because those are going to play very heavily into these election cycles, aren't they?
Yeah, they certainly are. The economy is always going to be the number one driver when it comes to elections here in the United States. Despite the fact that we've seen the Roe versus Wade or the Dobbs decision and Roe v. Wade overturned or remanded back to the states, that will certainly be a key issue for certain voters. But at the end of the day, most people want to be able to provide for their families. They don't want to see government continue to take, and their grocery prices and their energy bills go up. One thing before talking about the economy is the fact that Joe Biden's approval numbers went from terribly awfully bad to just awfully bad. And so he's still underwater. It's still, I believe he's 17 points underwater, but it wasn't as bad as it was before. So I think that's reflective of the fact that inflation is not continuing to spiral this month. It hasn't gotten better, but it hasn't gotten worse either. Energy prices in terms of oil and gas, those are they're starting to either recede a little bit or just staying neutral. And so those are things that voters they're still eminently important to them, but it's not as painful as it was the past few months, especially in June. So one of the questions we asked was, do you believe that we are in a recession? So 66% said they agree that we are in a recession, despite the White House's protestations that we are not. That's the perception among likely North Carolina voters. We're in a recession. 19% said they disagreed with that. They don't think we're in a recession, but 10% weren't sure. They just didn't know either way. So they were certainly persuadable. But then another question that I think is really telling and concerning is, how worried are you about losing your job over the next 12 months? 25% said they're worried. 66% said they are not worried. So despite the fact that many are concerned about a recession, they think we're in a recession, they themselves think that their jobs are fairly secure. And I would say that's in part because of the tight labor market.
Yeah, Brooke Medina joining us. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. There's a couple more items on this polling data, stuff that's not getting talked about right now, but things that are showing up on ballots, like Medicaid expansion, like abortion. We're going to talk about that. Also, she's got a story about eminent domain that's absolutely going to grind your teeth if you care anything at all about liberty and due process. We're going to talk about that with her. More with the great Brooke Medina on Heard Tell right after this. We're back on Heard Tell, having a great conversation with our friend Brooke Medina, returning to Heard Tell after too long of an absence. I want to talk about this in the last two items in this Civitas poll. Here's something that I found really interesting. It's not getting a lot of play right now, but once we get through the election year and we start doing some legislating again, this is going to come back up. Medicaid expansion has been a big ticket item It's been going state to state. It passes almost every time it comes up in a state, whether it's a red state or blue state, interestingly or not. It's one of those phenomenons. But your polling has an interesting data point here. 50% disapproved of executive orders to expand Medicaid dollars to be used to pay out of state, especially when it comes to things like abortion, especially when it comes to things like healthcare. I think the thing here is very clear that voters are okay with doing this themselves when it comes up on a ballot. They don't like executive orders on stuff like this. And especially when it comes to something like an abortion thing, something like that. I thought that was a really interesting data point that kind of runs counter to electoral stuff. But when you look at it, people want to say in that, they just don't want to be in pen and ink.
Yeah, I think that what this shows in the polling is that the North Carolina electorate is actually somewhat pro-choice to some degree. Only 7% of those that we polled actually said that they believe abortion should be illegal in every circumstance. Otherwise, it was to degree. Only 22% thought that abortion should be legal under every circumstance. So that shows, first off, how the North Carolina electorate is divided on this issue. And it's certainly just not strictly pro-life versus pro-choice. It's on a spectrum. And that shows up in the Medicaid expansion question, or the Medicaid question, as far as should North Carolinians be paying for abortions? And that's an entirely different story. So someone might say they are very pro-choice, or at least to a degree, but they still don't believe that the taxpayer should be the one footing that bill of such a highly contentious, highly political issue. I'd be curious also to see with our next poll, if we ask them a similar question about student loan forgiveness or debt cancellation, and see how they feel about that. There are a lot of programs or theories or ideas that voters will support in theory, but it's an entirely different story sometimes when it boils down to whether or not they will be paying for that particular issue. So,
yeah, and you're based out of the Raleigh-Durham area. That's a big college area, of course. You got the big three up there: Duke, North Carolina, and NC State. What's the talk around there? Because this is an area that has one of the highest educational rates in all the country. It's well known for its university system. You know, you do comms, so you're paying attention to the news feeds, you're watching the timelines, you're talking to people. What's been the reaction to that? Because you're in an area where that's probably more of an issue than maybe in some other places. Of course, also a big tech area now, so a lot of higher end educated folks, a higher educated workforce. What's folks saying? What's your read on that now that we've got a couple days in on it?
On the student debt cancellation, it's interesting. I would say that there are so many beneficiaries of that debt cancellation. I believe about 75 million Americans out of 330. So this is definitely impacting a sizable portion of the population, impacting in a good way. It's benefiting them. So overall, I would say it's very, very split. There are those people who would say, I'm benefiting from this personally, but in terms of fiscal conservatism and my principles on that, I disagree with this. Granted, Raleigh-Durham area is not brimming with fiscal conservatives whatsoever. It's definitely academics that lean left. So many of them are celebrating this. They think that this is, or they will say publicly that this is a justice issue, or this is the way in which we are definitely helping the lower income Americans that have taken out college debt. But it's so much more nuanced than that. And so I will be curious to see, if we poll it next month, what the crosstabs say and how this breaks down into Democrats versus Republicans versus unaffiliateds, where they stand on this particular issue. But one of the things I would advise people is, it's one thing to support this in theory because you believe that it is a way to help the American public become more educated without saddling them with debt at the outset of their careers. But it's another thing to actually have to figure out the way to pay for this. It's going to be exceedingly expensive. And there will be blue collar American workers who chose not to go to college. One of them I've cited on Twitter before is my father-in-law. He was an immigrant, blue collar worker, works hotel security down in Florida. He's going to be one of the type of people that pays for this for a young attorney couple who's making $249,000 a year. So there are some messaging issues that the White House is trying to get out in front of on this and create a narrative that this is just about really helping those desperate, needy college students. And in some cases that will be, but in other cases, it's certainly not. And it's going to have an impact far more than just the wealthiest or the corporations. It's going to directly impact the taxes of those that are definitely maybe more of the bottom 30%.
Yeah, if you poll it, we'll definitely want to talk about it, because I'm kind of letting this breathe for a minute, because I know what I think about it, but I think this is going to have to shake out a little bit, because I'm seeing, I think there's a lot of people that even support it that just don't like how this is being done. I know some of our progressive friends are really upset that it's only $10,000 and $20,000 for the Pell grants. We'll see how this one shakes out. One more last thing in the Civitas poll I wanted to ask you about. This is where polling data gets useful, because it shows you just how splintered people are on an issue. We already talked about, everybody said gas is an issue, 87%. That's unheard of in polling, to get anybody to agree to 87% on anything. But when you go to break it down, what to do about it, 37% said the state should prioritize environment at the risk of high energy prices. 45% said they should prioritize affordability and reliability in energy over carbon emissions. And then you got 17% that aren't sure, but because they probably just don't want to answer a sticky question. That's a hard bridge to gap. That's where this debate's going to be. It's where it's been for a long time. This is where it's going to be for a while, because people like the idea of clean energy. They like the idea of being environmentally conscious. Even conservatives, you need to call it conservation instead of environmentalism, but they want to take care of the earth too. But this is where the rubber meets the road, and there's a gap here that isn't going to get bridged anytime real soon, and the polling shows that, doesn't it?
It does. Well, let's liken this to the abortion Medicaid question. It's one thing to agree with something or like it in theory. It's another to actually have to foot the bill for it. And same with the energy prices. Many people want to go green, and I would say go nuclear then. But they also realize, okay, my family is coming up on a winter. The elderly are coming up on possibly a difficult winter. We've seen rolling blackouts in California. We've seen what happened with Texas and their huge winter storm, and the importance of energy reliability. We know what it costs to drive back and forth to work, to the grocery store, to our kids' soccer games. So they are importing their real life experiences. Importing is not the right word there, but they're looking at their real life experiences. And it sounds nice to be very clean energy green, especially the ways in which I would say progressive left or environmentalists have said is the right way to be clean energy and energy independent. But in reality, many people are just hurting on this front, and they're actually probably going to see energy costs rise by another 30 to 50%, depending on what the legislature and what Duke Energy, for example, require in their clean energy portfolio to satisfy what Governor Roy Cooper has mandated, which is essentially a Paris climate agreement. He wants zero carbon emissions by 2030. And so they're starting to develop a 50-year energy plan. And this is going to heavily rely on, unless people change course, unless the Utilities Commission changes course, this is going to heavily rely on wind and solar energy, which we know is not affordable and it's not reliable. And so this is a really big, there's a big iceberg under the surface with this particular issue that North Carolinians or anyone else that's just interested in this topic is wise to keep an eye on over the next couple of years.
Yeah, it's not going away, and it's going to get louder. And like you said, winter's coming. And if you've never been in Raleigh in wintertime, there's two cities I've lived in. Vegas when it rains and Raleigh when it snows. People lose their ever-loving minds. It's absolute insanity. We're going to take one quick break. When we come back with Brooke Medina, we're going to talk about her piece on this eminent domain story. This is something that's personal to me. I love discussing this because it's something that's not discussed enough, how the government can do this, when they should, when they shouldn't. Brooke Medina continues with us right after this.
This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Grainger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgranger.com or just stop by. Granger, for the ones who get it done.
Every day, we rise, challenging ourselves to work for what we believe in. At U.S. Border Patrol, protecting our borders is more than a job. It's a calling. Agents answer the call, working together to keep our country and communities safe. If you're ready for a new mission, join U.S. Border Patrol and go beyond. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.
Actually, wait 2 seconds because the garbage truck just pulled into the cul-de-sac. All right, we're good. Dogs do not like the garbage truck. They find it offensive. Welcome back to Heard Tell. That's Brooke Medina. I'm Andrew Donaldson. Thank you for sticking with us. Okay, you wrote about this eminent domain story out in Chatham County. I'm going to get my biases on the table. The house I grew up in was built because of eminent domain because they lived down in the Gauley River Valley. They came in, they dammed it up, they built Summersville Lake. We had to move back up on top of the mountain up yonder. And they've been there ever since. They built that house because of eminent domain. That's where my mom grew up. That's where I grew up. Eminent domain is a real thing. Now, it's a tool the government has to have. We understand that. But how they wield it, where they wield it, and who they wield it against tells us whether it's a good usage or a bad usage or an amoral usage, or quite frankly, there's been some corrupt usages. We know the history in the U.S. It's been used against minority groups. It's been used against the poor. This thing can get ugly in a hurry, and we're talking about taking people's homes, businesses, and livelihoods. I've read through your piece. I've read the auxiliary stuff on this Chatham County situation. You tell the story, but as far as I can tell, unless there's something I'm missing, this looks egregious, this looks outrageous, and this looks like an abuse of governmental power to me. What's your take on it?
My take is amen. I think it's all of those things, and it's heartbreaking. Like you said, I'm not someone who doesn't think there is absolutely no place for eminent domain. Similar to I'm not someone who believes that there's no place for zoning. There are places, but the government has run roughshod over private property rights in favor of other politically favored private businesses to be able to set up shop. And that's an injustice that I think definitely and rightfully riles up many Americans. If we don't have private property rights, what do we really have? And I think too often there are so many conversations surrounding other types of rights that, right to healthcare, right to education, stuff like that, where we forget one of the most fundamental rights is life and property. And I work at the John Locke Foundation, and John Locke, the philosopher, was a huge proponent of property rights, beginning with the right to oneself as well as their actual property. And this is one of those cases here in North Carolina where I would say families like a woman named Lisa Stone, who's a Chatham County resident, as well as Jack Sanderson, another Chatham County resident, and their critically essential fundamental right to private property have been essentially cast aside by the government in order for a new startup company from Vietnam called VinFast to set up shop to create electric vehicles. So this actually flows nicely from our previous energy conversation and discussions around being environmentally friendly. So the government, particularly Governor Roy Cooper, has really celebrated bringing VinFast into North Carolina, so much so that we've given them a 32-year extension, essentially, to allow them to reside here in North Carolina and milk off the taxpayers for 32 years. We're giving them $1.25 billion. That's a division between state money as well as local money. That is money or tax incentives that are footed by the taxpayer. But to add insult to injury are these Chatham County residents, 27 homes, 5 businesses, at least 1 church that are now going to be either torn down or their properties receded a bit to allow for some infrastructure, some roads to make their way into the VinFast manufacturing facility, which has not yet been built. But these are people who have lived here in North Carolina, who have lived in their homes for between 50 and 70 years in some cases. and they refused to sell their property. So the government exercised eminent domain law and has subsequently taken their property to make way for this startup company.
Yeah, see, the startup company is the part of this that bothers me, because this is an unproven company. This is, I mean, it'd be one thing if it was like Ford, or even as much as I can't stand them, Tesla or something, something that's established. I guess it'd be one thing. This is an unproven startup company that we're giving a lot. Look, we're putting a beltway around Fayetteville right now, so that it's going near the property I own. They spent years on that. They had meetings. They put out maps. They showed everybody, like, look, we've gone around as much housing as we can, but this road has to go in certain places because it's got to link up to I-95. Like, the road has to go here, so we're going to have to take certain houses, but they're curving it to get around a lot of the major neighborhoods. They did everything they could. They did their due diligence, and now they're moving stuff, and they had to tear some homes down and whatever. That's the process that this is supposed to be. I don't see that process here. And I don't see it for something that's going to have all kinds of economical advantages, like a four in some places 6-lane highway that was badly needed to get around Fort Bragg, which is one of the biggest military installations. By the way, also for national security reasons, because they had to get the traffic away from Fort Bragg. That's a good use of eminent domain. I still don't like taking homes, but understandable. I see none of that process here. I see bright, shiny object that we can put on a bullet point, and we can put on fundraising, and we can put on a political resume. That's what this looks like to me. And the fact that this is an unproven private company makes it even worse in my eyes.
Yeah, you're right. There hasn't been due diligence conducted on this. I mean, I think it started in March or May is when it was approved in March, the taxpayer handout to VinFast. And then they started a few meetings over the summertime, and now people's properties are are subjected, or they are the casualties of this decision by the government. And again, like you said, this is an unproven company. Maybe VinFast does phenomenally well. We don't know yet. It is only just now starting to set up shop in California. They're making pre-orders for these electric vehicles, but we don't even know what the market demand is. We actually polled this not too long ago, asking North Carolinians, do you own an electric vehicle? Only around 2.5% even own an electric vehicle right now. And then we asked, well, do you plan on buying one? And this was during the height of gas prices. Only 12% said they even plan on buying one in the near future. So we don't really know what the market demand will be by the time the VinFast facility is created. But another component to this, I would say, this is an aside, but it's noteworthy, is that in North Carolina, electric vehicle makers can't even directly sell their vehicles here in North Carolina. So it's like we're creating this infrastructure on taxpayer dollars, taking people's homes and properties and businesses away from them. And a company that's only been around since 2017 in Vietnam and just now hitting U.S. shores. And we're doing all of these monumental, potentially cataclysmic decisions without really conducting a really good cost-benefit analysis. It's scary, it's concerning, but then when you think about the actual North Carolinians it's impacting directly, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah. Sorry, my mouth stopped working for no explicable reason whatsoever. Yeah, it's heartbreaking because anytime you can read, we'll link to it. You link in your piece, the News and Observer. The quotes from these people are just heartbreaking. You can imagine they talk about, they didn't get a lot of notice on this. I hope it works because I hope it's worth it what they're doing to these people, but I'm skeptical. So we'll see how it plays out and we'll keep an eye on it. But when we talk about a big, just to put a bow on this, we talk about a big concept like government accountability. This is why you got to have government accountability, because they can come in and take your house and then you got to fight them to not do it. And you're probably going to lose that fight. And it's frustrating stuff. Thank you for writing this piece. We're going to link to it. Like we always say, make sure you read the whole piece. Make sure you read all the linked materials. There's a cameo from our friend Scott Lincecum in there too. You might want to check that out. Brooke Medina, I love talking to you. It's great to have you back. We'll have you on more frequently. We'll try to get you in the rotation more often, but you're so busy because you're popular and such. Let folks know about all those busy things you do, where they can follow you, what you got going on with John Locke and elsewhere. You're also a great writer in your own right. Let folks know how they can keep up with you until we get you back on Her Tell again.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Andrew. And it's a delight every single time. So yes, have me on more often. But you can find me on Twitter. I'm just Brooke_Medina_. But definitely, I encourage you to follow the work of our reporters and our researchers at the John Locke Foundation, so you can find out more of what they're doing and the research they're doing to keep government accountable. And that's at johnlocke.org, as well as carolinajournal.com. We also have a special movie premiere. So if you're in the Raleigh area, we're actually going to be doing a movie screening called The Hong Konger. So if you believe in democracy, you believe that China is infringing upon the rights of those free citizens of Hong Kong, you'll be interested in this movie. It's at the Alamo Draft House on August 30th. And so if you go to johnlocke.org and go to our events section, you can get tickets, or shoot me a message. I'll give you a promo code so you can get a discount. But thank you guys so much for joining and listening.
Yeah, do all those sorts of things. We're doing that too, because we've got the Dissident Project with Young Voices. It's got Sarah Yo and some other folks that are actually Hong Kongers talking about what's happened to that country. I actually have family members that have married into the family from Hong Kong, so it's something I keep a close eye on. Terrible for the you want to talk about eminent domain? That's eminent domain on steroids, what China's done to Hong Kong. Brooke Medina, you are fantastic. Thank you so much, my friend. We'll talk again real soon.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.